on, I'd like to talk about practical epistemic injustice and the principle of charity, focusing on examples from the workplace, but I think the ideas extend beyond there. But it is a context that fits, first of all, my employment in a business school, and also, I think, just in the world, as we actually heard in our last commentary as well. So, first of all, the plan, give you some context, talk about the principle of charity and critical thinking and argumentation as it is thus far, take a look at how it might apply to practical reasoning and argumentation, connect it with the notion of epistemic credibility, talk about practical epistemic injustice and epistemic injustice harms, followed by a short chat about virtue and my naive attempt to perhaps provide a new articulation of a charity. So it sounds like a lot because it is. So first of all, I think as we've gone through the day, I realized it would be important to note that I have several points of overlap with previous speakers. In one way, it's comforting to know that we're thinking similar things. To all of you, let's co-author. I'm in. But on another level, it's also shown me how many differing views and ideas I tried to put into one paper, perhaps too many. Nevertheless, this is to assure you that I have not plagiarized these people very quickly. We fortunately came to similar ideas independently. But seeing the breadth of views expressed thus far also helped me see why I struggled preparing the work. The pseudo-conscious part of my head was touching on 100 issues and found it hard to narrow in on the subject in my fully conscious mind. So that means, unfortunately, my gracious and highly talented commentator received the reflection of that chaos. I've worked to try to make sense of my own internal confusion and uncertainty further since sending that paper to the commentator, and I hope the presentation helps make sense of what I've written so far. In short, I'm asking you for help to clarify the chaos. So without any further ado, what am I looking at? As many other people have articulated, the principle of charity in argumentation rather than its traditional characterization in the philosophy of language. And on my interpretation, the principle of fidelity is baked into most of the articulations I've seen in argumentation, though after hearing Professor Gaudu, I'm going to revisit what I think in terms of most there. But a lot of them include this notion of when in doubt. And for me, when in doubt is the way to include that you've tried to first follow fidelity, and it's when you're unsure about the meaning, that's when charity comes into play. So they don't always say it explicitly, but I think that's kind of where it is. And it's not about understanding someone's utterance, but the argumentative impact that they have. Several of the work in argumentation on this topic says it focuses on the evaluator. I've been, or the interpreter. I think I like interpreter better. This paper is aimed not just at us argumentation scholars, but I teach critical thinking and I use this all the time. And my very intelligent business students don't ever plan to be argumentation theorists. And I think that the topic I'm writing about is hopefully going to be something that they could benefit from as well. So by analyst and evaluator interpreter, I mean everybody from an independent outside evaluator, like Levinsky would talk about, all the way up to, just somebody hearing or reading in a novice kind of a sense, who's trying to make sense of what to do with the claims that they hear. And then theoretical and practical reasoning and argumentation have long been distinguished in reasoning and argumentation literature, but there's a dominance on the theoretical, I find, in almost every domain in argumentation, a little less so in philosophy, but sometimes more broadly. My goal here is to mostly show what happens when we start to take the practical seriously. So that's the context. So we've seen there's a growing number of views being expressed about the principle of charity in argumentation. And somebody earlier today had mentioned, I think it might have been Nathan, that one of the ways to organize these things is based on how strong they think the interpretation should be. And indeed, that's the approach that I try to take. So I go, at least at the beginning, from what is self-declared as kind of weakest to strongest. So in 2012, when I was actually working with Marcin at this time, I remember first discussing this paper over lunch when he wanted to run with it. I think it was a good idea. He situates his conversation within the dominant adversarial model of argumentation. Unsurprising, given that he comes from the pragmadialectical space, even though he's not a staunch pragmadialectician. But he argues in that context, in a dominant adversarial model, for a minimal role of charity for analysts, but none for arguers themselves. And that's partially because he wants to go with a commitment-based view, not the intention-based view. It, I think, boils down to this. He says as much towards the end of the paper. When you're in doubt, right? So again, after the principle of fidelity, when you are pretty confident about accuracy, um, first ask the parties, right? We heard that's an option through Professor Gadu as well at some points. Two, look for a mutually charitable interpretation, and three, then pick one depending on the context. Sorry, I gotta move you all. There we go. Okay. Increasing in strength, Stevens calls her position stronger than moderate. If we were going to go minimal, moderate, strong, she's stronger than moderate. And she characterizes Gohier as saying that arguers aim at having reasons, and hers is stronger than moderate because it's not that they aim at having those reasons, is that they do actually have those reasons. And she provides moral considerations, strong moral considerations for including the stronger than moral or stronger than moderate principle of charity view. And her advice, when you're in doubt, again, attempt to gain insight into the reasons the interlocutor is trying to offer from the interlocutor's point of view. And she acknowledges how hard that is, and that it does require a substantial amount of work. Most recently, this is my unique part here because I imagine not many of you have seen this one yet. So it's my attempt to show you I'm a quality researcher. Ignacio Villaro from Uruguay in a text on philosophy of language in Uruguay in 2024 also argues within the dominant adversarial model in the sense that he focuses on pragmadialectics, but he says when you're in the logical mode, i.e. for him, essentially a truth-finding mode, then there's an omnipresent imperfect obligation for maximal charity. Right. So when you're trying to find the truth, you should be offering the Scriven version, find the strongest argument possible. But that's an imperfect obligation because you can't hold it all the time. I'm not going to dive in too much more on that. So this is how I've organized the state of the art. Others have done it better than me, but I think this gives an appropriate overview for my purposes. I also got to watch the time. Please cut me off if I keep going. Okay. So, wow, I messed up the animation. So let's just do this. So the principle of charity in practical reasoning and argumentation. My question is, do the existing approaches work, right? Can we adapt them for decision making and for know-how, right? So if we're in a situation where somebody is trying to come to a decision, they're working with intentions, then we're in a situation where it might be a little bit tricky. If you consider practical reasoning coming to a normative belief about what to do, then the existing interpretations of the principle of charity might, cover more ground than I'm attributing here. So just to clarify, I think of practical reasoning as concluding in an intention to act, and practical knowledge as either being that intention or a know-how. So let's think about it here. So let's imagine that we have a new employee at an accounting firm, and she's considering presenting the following two claims to her boss. Number one, I intend to get promoted as quickly as possible. And two, to do so, it would be best to complete this spreadsheet by the end of the day. Right. So you could imagine there, she concludes with, I intend to complete the spreadsheet by the end of the day. Right. That's one possible interpretation. So we can ask, what would happen if we take Lewinsky's approach, right? Well, we could ask the parties, right? We could say to her, is that what you meant to say? You didn't say you're going to intend to finish it. Is that what you meant? In which case, if she says yes or no, we don't really need charity because she's just sorted it out, and fidelity takes precedence, or in agreement with Gadu, accuracy takes precedence. We now know the answer. We can just go from there. But there's lots of cases where you don't have the speaker available, right, or the writer available. I would argue probably the majority of them that we're concerned with. Say, for example, she's gone home. It's now the weekend. The boss doesn't see the sheet. Whatever reason she's not around, right? Okay. So the mutually charitable interpretation that requires knowing the boss's position. I don't know how to be charitable to the boss because I don't know if they're in a disagreement, if they're not in a disagreement. All I've gotten is her line of reasoning. I can't attribute the boss anything to determine what would be beneficial or not, or charitable or not. Right. And same thing if we're going to pick to favor one depending on context. I don't really know what that would mean. Right. I don't know what the boss's position would be, or what other charitable positions are in the offing, right? Or which one to weigh. So I don't really see how that would hold, right? I don't see how we could actually follow this theoretically or practically in terms of practical reasoning, right? So I think it's also true for know-how, right? If somebody says, "Look, yeah, you can trust me to fill in that Excel sheet. I know how to do it." And the boss says, "Well, what do you mean you know how, or how well do you know?" And the employee says, "Oh, pretty well." Okay. Well, we could ask her, "What do you mean by pretty well?" But if we don't have that, we don't know what the boss thinks about what she means by pretty well, or who to favor. Jump into the end, the maximal interpretation, right? You might be inclined to think, well, the examples that I gave you are really hinting at modus ponens, right? If I intend to get promoted as quickly as possible, I must complete the spreadsheet. I do intend to get promoted as quickly as possible, so I intend to complete the spreadsheet. Now, I think that would be a sensible strong or maximal interpretation because of the force of deductive logic. But I have no idea whether that breaches essentially the principle of fidelity or that's what she wanted. And not only that, providing that maximal interpretation, as I'm going to show a little bit later, can lead to ethical and prudential harms. So would we want to do that? I don't think so for several reasons that I'll discuss a little bit later, um, and that I've hinted at least already now, right? So both of these views, I think, raise an important question. What's the role of the principle of charity in non-adversarial and perhaps not even dialogical argumentation, but just what I call reasoning, right? Reasoning, which is coming to a conclusion through inferences that may not involve anybody else. Right. So if you're just trying to understand somebody else's reasoning, what's the role of charity here? Uh, I think it's unclear if we only look at these two. So how about Stevens? As you can likely suspect, I take up her position most closely. I think for several reasons that I'll explain as we continue as well. Um, but one of the things that I noted, and has since been clarified, is that she talks about arguers having reasons, and that's what we should do for charity. As it was articulated at that point, there should be a big a word here that I did not insert, but I've heard others insert in their presentations, and that's that arguers have strong or good reasons. For me, what I found was that the way that it was articulated in the original work was a good principle, almost again like Gadu was saying, that understanding that there have reasons is a respect thing, right? It's not necessarily a charitable thing. I believe they have reasons, but they might genuinely be poor or weak reasons. And that for me is not charitable, just recognizing that they have those weak reasons. If I have to say, I recognize that they have good reasons. Um, at the same time, for me, that right now doesn't seem charitable. It seems almost just biased, which is, if I'm going in with that assumption, they're good reasons. That's a bias going in, not a decision on being charitable or not. So these are some of the issues that I've seen in the existing approaches so far, especially when it comes to um, practical reasoning, right? If we're thinking about Stevens in terms of know how, again, the employee says, "Oh, I know how to use Excel pretty well," right? Okay, well, I can think she has good reasons. She's graduated from a business school, things like that, right? And I could imagine that she has all those reasons and provide all that evidence. But again, I'm not positive that when in doubt, that's the best thing to be doing, especially from a prudential perspective. It may be unwise to do that. How am I doing? Okay. So, assuming strong reasons complicates, I think, when the principle of charity should be applied, right? It's not, it makes it difficult to tell the when in doubt part, right? Okay. Yeah. I think I said this in other words, right? Do we assume they have strong reasons after we've assumed they have weak reasons, right? Is the background assumption their reasons are weak, and that's why we have to trigger the PoC, right? The principle of charity. Okay. So if these aren't going to, translate smoothly into the practical realm, are there other concepts that might fit better? The first one that came to my mind that I happen to work on, of course, so a bit of a relevancy bias or recency bias there, is the notion of, say, epistemic credibility, something that Govier talks about as rhetorical credibility, and later Fricker discusses as epistemic credibility in all of those conversations since 2007 on epistemic injustice. And so broadly speaking, epistemic credibility is the credibility associated with being a knower and a transmitter of knowledge. She distinguishes two types: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. I'm setting aside any conversation about the hermeneutical for the moment. I don't see a direct application. I'm going to focus just on the testimonial component, right? So most of the literature characterizes testimonial injustice as a deficit of credibility towards a speaker based on an identity prejudice, but careful reading of her work and others shows that it's actually just a misattribution more neutrally, because she does talk about credibility excesses as well, and how they are also harmful. So I call it the misattribution of credibility. It can be deficient, right? So she provides the example of not a police officer not believing the testimony of a witness because they were black. I've also heard the examples of an excess based on skin color, where people of Southeast Asian descent are often believed to know more about mathematics, right? And Fricker talks about and shows there are studies that demonstrate that American sounding, that includes Canadians, American sounding English speakers tend to believe that British sounding speakers are smarter, and that's used in marketing all over the place as well. So these are credibility excesses, and we might think, oh, we think they're even smarter. That's a great thing, but I'm going to hopefully show a little bit later that it also can result in harm. So these are the things that are kind of more related to the practical, even though even in the epistemic credibility part, they stick to the testimonial, right? And the testimonial has beliefs most of the time in almost all of the literature, right? So we can't use credibility synonymously with charity, at least in the ways they've been used so far. What are some similarities and differences? First of all, the principle of a charity only applies to the underassessment, I find, right? Very few people say, oh, you should charitably weaken that person's argument, although that might be actually needed sometimes, right? Whereas epistemic credibility replies to both over and under. To be clear, epistemic credibility is not a principle. It's a concept, at least as worded. It's not a principle, even though I think it suggests one, and one that is even taken up in Fricker's own work on this, which we'll get to, right? And I think the principle of charity tends to look at the argument, right? What is the argument, and how is it stronger or weaker, or be understood longer or steeper, weaker? But credibility, and I should say that Stevens is an exception to that, I believe, which I really, really appreciate, and partly why I take up a similar view to her own. So credibility looks at the arguer, right? How credible is the person, not how strong or weak is the argument, as a product. So it humanizes, I think, the notion in several ways that are important. Um, yeah, because we're not talking about being charitable with AI most of the time. We're talking about being charitable with people. And finally, epistemic credibility asks us to look at ourselves and others, right? How could I be wrong, right? Whereas the principle of charity tends to focus only on the other one. What are they thinking? What reasons do they have, right? But epistemic credibility says, how might I be misassessing the credibility there? How might I be misunderstanding, right? So it's kind of more bi-directional than it is argument or one way focused. Still with me? Sorry for all the ideas getting crammed into one here. So like the principle of charity literature, the epistemic injustice literature focuses mostly, I think, on the theoretical, right? They don't actually talk about reasoning in the epistemic injustice or the epistemic credibility literature so much. They don't seem to tie the notion of beliefs to the arrival at the belief through reasoning. It's just kind of all assumed in the background. But it isn't almost always about, do you believe this person or that based on their testimony, which to me shows generally a focus on, do you believe their knowledge, right? Rather than, do you believe they can do something, or do you believe they're a competent decision maker, right? So when we're talking about a knower and a transmitter of knowledge, right, I think importantly that a knower can be someone who has reasons for an intention, or who has know-how, right, a practical knowledge of how to do things. And to demonstrate, we could see something like the glass ceiling being an area where women specifically, women identifying people, are discredited as competent decision makers and doers based on a systematic identity prejudice, right? Their identity as a woman, right? So simply because of that, They don't believe they can do things, or they don't believe they can necessarily make decisions, and those are often reasons attributed to their inability to ascend to the highest positions in corporate power. One of the few scholars who does talk about epistemic injustice and know how is the late Catherine Hawley, and she provides an example of the New York Symphony starting to hold auditions behind a black curtain. And when doing so, the number of women who were able to join the symphony dramatically increased. And that shows that it wasn't about the know-how originally, the ability to play the instruments, but about the systematic identity prejudice that was being attributed to them when they were not behind the curtain that had been preventing them from, um, having equal or increased representation in the symphony. If all this is accurate, right, I think that there's three essentially types of testimonial injustice. The classical version, which is theoretical and belief based. You don't believe what somebody says that they know as a matter of, say, propositional fact. But the new ones that I'm pointing to here are ones that are saying essentially, I don't believe that you are competent to make your own decisions or form your own intentions. Or I don't believe that you know how to do what you say you know how to do because of your identity. And like I said, this one has been addressed a little bit in the literature, but only in one article from what I've seen. Not at all in the principle of charity stuff, but in the epistemic injustice stuff. And yeah, this one is pretty novel. Uh, okay, so everybody loves a good chart. Have to have a chart. Here's a chart about the harms that can result if we do these things, right? So we have the ethical harms and prudential harms. And then we have what happens when we have the excess and the deficit, right? So if we're stereotyping somebody saying, children are good with technology, right? As I get older, I start to fall into this trap more and more and more. And when I was young, I was good with technology because I knew how to set up the VCR. So that was, the pinnacle of being technologically inclined. And I was always like, oh, he's the tech guy. In my classroom of peers, I was the least technically knowledgeable person there was, right? But among my family, that was a stereotype, right? So, ethically speaking, if you have an excess of theoretical credibility, it has the potential to embarrass somebody, right? When I couldn't fix something technological, I felt really embarrassed from people trying to tell me, "Oh, he was the one," right? And can also reduce people to mere means, right? Oh, those people know what they're doing, so use them for that, right? And on the theoretical side, if it's a deficit, right, there's the traditional examples we've heard of. It's dehumanizing already, but it can also, as we've seen in the glass ceiling example, hinder advancement, which is unjust to people who deserve advancement opportunities. In the practical realm, I think it places undue burden of work on people, right? If you think Southeast Asians are good with math and all of a sudden they have a whole lot more math problems that they have to deal with because of your bias, that's not so great. And a deficit way, it's disempowering, right? Prudentially, there's just costs, right, associated with it. It's time wasting to have an excess and then find out, oh, it didn't work. You have to go find another person to do it or get the answer. And if you discredit somebody, then you're missing out on knowledge you could have had. And that's also a time waste. Right. Practically speaking, if somebody is given a credibility excess, well, they'll do it, and then they'll do it incorrectly, and then you have to find somebody to fix it. Right. And if they're discredited, then they won't be doing things that they could be doing. Right. Or other people will be doing it in a poorer way than the other person could have done it. Okay. So, how can we be charitable in these situations is really what we're after. As you might have imagined, I might get here a long time ago in a land far, far away. Somebody talked about the harms associated with too much or too little of something. Guy named Aristotle, right? He was pretty smart. He called them vices. So for me, this is what I was saying earlier. Epistemic credibility suggests a principle, right, as a mean between extremes, right, as Aristotle would say, when we have too much or too little, right. And some of the virtues that could be associated in these things, if we're looking for a new principle here, would be like a principle of credibility, right, as a virtue, which would be, say, a mean between overly suspicious that they're lying about what they can do, or overly gullible, where you believe that they're really good at everything, right? Trust is a similar connected notion. I honestly don't know the connection between credibility and trust. I think there's a whole paper there that I haven't sorted out in my scattered head yet. But again, suspicion, right? You're too suspicious of somebody, or you trust them, or you're too gullible, right? And of course, as we heard earlier as well, and I strongly agree, humility is crucial, right? Recognizing that you may be miscrediting somebody, right? So you shouldn't be so arrogant as to know what they know, right? But you also could be diffident, which is a word I literally learned today, which would be the opposite of arrogance, right? So if you're yeah, if you're diffident, that's the only way I can say it. That's why I had to look it up. 7 minutes. Okay. We actually have lots of time. I'm going fast as I would, unfortunately, in my student lectures as well. So what's a new principle we might be able to run with that kind of helps incorporate the practical into things here, right? How about something like this? Making a conscious effort to acknowledge potential and likely biases, causing an inaccurately negative or positive judgment of the reasoning and abilities of a claim maker, then providing that claim maker with the benefit of the doubt. To anticipate Professor Gadu, uh, this says here inaccurately already. So this is the accuracy part. This is the charity part, right? This is the check for reasons to doubt, and this is the charity, what you do when you're in doubt. So I agree. It puts accuracy before charity, but you do need the charity there, right? And it includes then, right? I think a potential, if wordsmith better or clarified, to be applied to both the theoretical and practical realms, right? Perhaps as a charitable principle of credibility, right? What we're looking for is the credibility of a speaker when we're looking to be, charitable to them in a theoretical sense, but also charitable in terms of our appreciation of their abilities to form intentions or actually perform the claims to know-how that they make. So I mentioned before, I think it's close to Stevens, and this is because um, uh, it focuses on the people rather than the argument. Stevens also does talk about biases, but limits it in that original paper just to the dominant adversarial model, and I think it can be extended. That's not to say she doesn't acknowledge it, but just let's take it a bit further. So the main difference is that our default position, I think, given ingrained biases, is one of epistemic inaccuracy. So why do we need the principle of charity? Because we're almost always being influenced in directions of excess or deficiency because of implicit biases, social and just cognitive, right? We have our confirmation biases and things like that that are always going to lead us to some sort of, or have the potential to lead us to some sort of an inaccuracy. So charity is going to be needed almost always. To at least this principle. Two, I think it provides better guidance for the practical realm than the existing articulations of a principle of charity. And the main similarity with her approach is that it remains focused on the people involved. But I'm going to make more of an effort to highlight the interpreter as a source of error rather than just the arguer as a potential prospect for a charity. Anything else I want to say? Last thing I'm going to say is I have a footnote at the very beginning of the paper that thinks this approach and most of the approaches so far are problematic because they're the principle of charity, in my view, should be highly contextually dependent. And trying to generalize like this is for me a bit of a wrong approach. I think the principle of charity, when you're aiming for truth versus when you're aiming to convict a felon, play entirely different roles. And so I struggle to find one general principle here. So I would want to say that anything that I have here, generally speaking, would be open to tweaking and interpretation depending on context. Oh, thank you. That's all I got. Feel free to email me any thoughts if you don't have time to share them today.